Would you betray your best friend if the whole world demanded it? That's the question Thomas faced the day he met Ibrahim Traoré again, not as a boy running barefoot in the village, but as the president of Burkina Faso. And what Thomas chose that day changed everything. The sun was merciless that afternoon. It burned down on the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, where sweat clung to men's brows like a second skin. Among the chaos of motorbikes, vendors, and shouting voices, one man worked silently in a cramped roadside workshop. His hands were rough, scarred by years of labor, yet steady as he hammered the rusted metal before him. His name was Thomas. For most, he was just another mechanic, another face swallowed by poverty. But to those who truly knew him, Thomas was something more. A man who carried within him the echo of a friendship long buried under time. A friendship with a boy who once ran barefoot across the same village fields, chasing dreams as wild as the wind. That boy's name was Ibrahim. Today, Ibrahim was no ordinary man. He had become the leader of a nation, a captain who wore the uniform of power and the burden of hope. And as fate would have it, the path of these two men, once inseparable friends, was about to collide again in a way no one could have predicted. Because destiny has a strange way of testing loyalty. Sometimes it comes through whispers of betrayal, other times through the lure of riches. But today, it began with something far simpler. The roar of an engine, the sudden silence of a convoy, and the gaze of a president stepping out onto a dusty street, staring directly into the eyes of the friend he thought he'd lost forever. Long before uniforms and politics, before the burden of leadership or the scars of poverty, there were just two boys running through the fields of their village. Thomas and Ibrahim. Their laughter carried across the dusty paths, their bare feet drumming the earth as if the world itself was their playground. They shared everything. The same worn-out football patched a dozen times, the same bowl of millet when food was scarce, even the same dreams whispered under the stars. They promised each other that one day they would change the fate of their people. But time is a cruel thief. Ibrahim was pulled into the army, where discipline, strategy, and the weight of responsibility shaped him into a soldier. And then the leader, Thomas, left behind, inherited only hardship. His family's land withered in droughts, debts chained him to poverty, and soon he was working with his hands, fixing machines that never seemed to stay alive longer than a week. Years passed, and their paths drifted apart, one boy rising into power, the other sinking deeper into struggle. Yet in both of them, the bond of childhood never truly died. It lay dormant, waiting for the day when fate would pull them back into each other's orbit. Because what neither of them knew was that their reunion would not be one of joy, but of fire, suspicion, and choices that would test the very limits of loyalty. It was a day like no other. The streets of Ouagadougou were heavy with dust and whispers, the kind that follow every presidential convoy. Sirens wailed, boots struck the ground in perfect rhythm, and people craned their necks just to catch a glimpse of the man they now called their leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. But in the middle of the crowd, among vendors clutching baskets and children waving flags, stood a figure that did not belong. His clothes were worn, his hands stained with grease, his eyes tired from years of labor. And yet, when Ibrahim stepped out of his armored vehicle, his gaze fell instantly upon him. Time seemed to stop. It wasn't the roar of the soldiers or the chants of the people that filled Ibrahim's mind, it was a memory. A dusty football rolling through the sand. A boy laughing, sprinting, shouting his name. Amos, his brother of the past, his shadow of the present. For a moment, the president was no longer the most powerful man in the country. He was just Ibrahim, the barefoot boy who once dreamed beneath the stars with his closest friend. The air between them burned with questions no one else could hear. Why was Thomas here, of all places? What story had carved the wrinkles into his face? And most importantly, would this reunion be a blessing or a storm waiting to break? The silence between them lasted only seconds, but to Ibrahim it felt like years collapsing all at once. 1,000 memories rushed in, yet so did 1,000 doubts. He was no longer a boy chasing dreams with Thomas. He was a president surrounded by enemies, spies, and men who smiled in daylight but plotted in the shadows of night. Thomas stood frozen, unsure if he should bow, salute, or simply turn away. His grease-stained hands twitched nervously, as though they had no place in a world now guarded by soldiers with rifles. Around them, the convoy had halted. Guards tensed, hands hovering near triggers, watching every flicker of movement. The air thickened with suspicion. Finally, Ibrahim stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel, each step slow, deliberate, heavy with both power and hesitation. Thomas. The name escaped his lips like a half-forbidden secret. The mechanic's chest tightened. He hadn't heard his name spoken like that in years, not with warmth, not with disbelief, but with a mix of recognition and caution. He wanted to smile, to laugh, to remind his friend of all they once were. But the eyes that stared back at him were no longer the playful gaze of a boy. They were sharp, calculating, burdened by power. Captain Ibrahim. Thomas finally whispered, his voice almost cracking. It was not the reunion either of them had once imagined under the stars of their youth. A ripple passed through the crowd. Ordinary people felt something unusual unfolding, though they didn't know what. To them, it was just a mechanic being noticed by the president. But to Ibrahim, it was more dangerous than that. He had to wonder, why here, why now? Had Thomas been sent to him by fate, or by those who sought to break him? The tension was unbearable. Ibrahim's guards shifted, some whispering warnings in his ear. One even stepped forward, ready to pull him away. But Ibrahim raised his hand, firm, commanding, and the world seemed to freeze again. "Let him speak," Ibrahim said, his voice steady, but his heart restless. And in that fragile moment, between suspicion and longing, between power and memory, two lives that had grown apart stood face to face again on the edge of trust or betrayal. The convoy resumed its march, but Ibrahim's mind did not. That face, Thomas's face, haunted him as though it carried the weight of unfinished chapters. Minutes later, away from the chanting crowds, the president made a decision that startled even his closest advisors. "Bring him to me," Ibrahim ordered. His tone left no room for argument. Thomas was escorted through corridors of stone and steel into the heart of power itself, the presidential compound. The walls smelled of polished wood and old dust, the air heavy with silence. Here, behind closed doors, the chants of the people and the bark of soldiers faded. Only two men remained, a leader burdened by the fate of a nation, and a mechanic whose hands carried the dirt of a different battlefield. For a long moment, neither spoke. Thomas shifted nervously in his chair, his rough hands clenched together. Ibrahim, sitting across the table, studied him carefully, not with the eyes of a friend, but with the piercing gaze of a soldier trained to detect lies. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "I never thought I'd see you again. Not like this." His voice trembled, carrying both relief and sorrow. Ibrahim leaned forward, his tone sharp yet tinged with curiosity. "Why were you there, Thomas? Why now, after all these years?" Thomas looked down, his jaw tightening. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, yet now that it was here, the words clawed at his throat. "Because life has left me no choice. Because the country we dreamed of, the future we spoke of, it feels like it's slipping away, and I can't stand in silence anymore." The room grew colder. For the first time, Ibrahim saw not just his childhood friend, but a man beaten by struggle, hardened by survival. He saw someone who carried wounds not on his skin, but in his soul. And yet, a shadow of doubt lingered. Could Thomas truly be here for friendship, or was he a thread woven into a trap? As the silence stretched, one thing became clear. This meeting was not just a reunion. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, where memory, loyalty, and suspicion would collide in ways neither of them could control. The cheering outside faded like a dream, replaced by the low hum of silence inside the presidential compound. Soldiers lined the corridors, their rifles steady, their eyes sharp. But inside that one dimly lit chamber, it was not rifles that weighed the heaviest, it was memory. Thomas sat stiffly on the edge of a chair, the grease from his hands marking the polished wood as if to remind the room that he did not belong here. His eyes darted between the walls, adorned with national flags and maps, and the man who now sat across from him. Ibrahim Traoré, no longer the barefoot boy of their childhood, but the captain president of a nation. Yet Ibrahim's gaze wasn't the gaze of a president addressing a citizen. It was sharper, colder. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes searching, dissecting. "Thomas," he said slowly, as if testing the weight of the name after so many years. "Why were you there in that crowd? Why now?" Thomas's breath caught. He had prepared so many words in the darkness of lonely nights, but under the scrutiny of Ibrahim's eyes, they vanished like smoke. "Because I had to see if it was true," he whispered. "If the boy I once called brother still lived inside the man everyone calls their leader." Ibrahim's jaw tightened. That simple sentence carried the force of years, years of silence, years of roads diverging, years of one climbing to power while the other sank into survival. The silence thickened. Then Thomas's voice cracked, heavier now, raw with emotion. "We dreamed once, Ibrahim. We dreamed of a country where no child would go to bed hungry, where we would not kneel to foreigners, where our people would stand tall. But look outside the palace walls, look at the streets. Dust in their mouths, hunger in their bellies. The future we promised each other. Where is it?" For a heartbeat, Ibrahim said nothing. His chest rose and fell with a measured calm, but inside his mind a storm brewed. He had heard words like these before, angry chants, bitter protests, endless complaints. But from Thomas, it was different. This was not an enemy. This was the voice of a past that still carried truth. Still, doubt lingered. Ibrahim's tone dropped to a near whisper, heavy, deliberate. "You speak like a man with nothing to lose." But I ask myself, is it my brother speaking now, or a messenger sent to test my guard? Thomas's eyes flared, pain. "If I were here to betray you, Ibrahim, I would not have come at all. I came because I could not carry the weight of silence anymore." The room froze. Two men stared at each other, not president and citizen, not soldier and mechanic, but two boys from the same dusty street, separated by fate yet bound by memory. And in that moment, one truth became clear. This was not just a reunion. This was a reckoning. The air between them was thick, every second stretching longer than the last. Then Thomas leaned forward, his rough, calloused hands gripping the edge of the table as though the wood itself could anchor him to this moment. His voice trembled at first, but then grew stronger, steadier, carrying a weight no soldier's gun could silence. "Ibrahim, while you were fighting wars in the mountains, I was fighting another kind of war. A war with empty pockets. A war with a broken roof that leaked each time it rained. A war with a stomach that twisted itself inside out because there was no bread to quiet it. Do you know what it means to look at your children and see them beg for food you cannot give? Do you know the shame, Ibrahim?" Ibrahim's eyes flickered, but he stayed silent, watching. Thomas's voice cracked. his words sharp now, laced with anger. Our village. The one where we chase footballs made of rags. It has not changed. It is still dust, still hunger, still darkness when the sun goes down. And yet I turn on the radio and I hear about projects, promises, billions in aid, endless speeches. Tell me, Ibrahim, where does it all go? Who eats from that feast? Because I know it's not us. He paused, chest heaving. Memories pressed against his words like thorns. When I walked here today, I passed soldiers in polished boots. I passed trucks filled with supplies. And all I could think was, why must power always feed itself first, while the people wait at the gate like beggars? The room seemed to shrink with every word. Ibrahim's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed flickers of something. Guilt, maybe, or anger at being forced to confront truths he had learned to bury under duty. Thomas softened then, his voice almost pleading. I did not come here to curse you, Ibrahim. I came here because I still remember the boy who promised me we would rise together. And I need to know, does that boy still live in you? Or has he died in this palace? Silence. A silence heavy enough to bend the walls, heavy enough to make a soldier flinch outside the door. Ibrahim's hands curled into fists on the table, not in rage, but in restraint. For the first time since Thomas had entered the room, the captain president looked not like a leader, not like a soldier, but like a man haunted by the past, trapped between duty and memory. Ibrahim leaned back slowly, his eyes fixed on Thomas as if searching for the right words in his face. His chest rose and fell, heavy, like a man carrying stones no one else could see. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, his voice came low, steady, but edged with exhaustion. Thomas, you think I don't know hunger? You think I don't remember what it was like to sleep with an empty stomach, to watch our mothers divide one bowl of millet among 10 mouths? I was there. I bled from the same wounds you described. He paused, his gaze hardening. But standing here as president, I have learned something you cannot imagine. Power is not a gift. It is a curse. Every decision I make, Thomas, comes with a blade on both sides. Feed one village, and another cries betrayal. Strengthen the army, and the people call me a dictator. Sit idle, and they call me weak. Tell me, which path is free of blood? His voice deepened, filled with an intensity that made the very guards outside the door stiffen. You ask me where the money goes. I will tell you, it goes to patching holes left by men who came before me, to keeping foreign hands out of our soil, to buying time, Thomas. Time for us to breathe before the world swallows us whole. Do you know how many threats hang over this country? Do you know how many nations sit in silence, waiting for us to collapse? He leaned forward now, his fists pressing into the table, eyes blazing. You call me your brother. Then understand this. I carry not just your hunger, but the hunger of 20 million souls. And every night, when I close my eyes, I see them. I see mothers weeping. I see fathers breaking. And I hear the whispers of a nation asking me to save them. Do you think I sleep, Thomas? Do you think I eat without shame? His voice cracked then, softer, more human. I am not the boy you once knew. That boy died the day I put on this uniform. And yet, in my heart, I pray that he still guides me. Because if he doesn't, then maybe I have already become what you fear. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't filled with accusation or anger. It was filled with truth, raw and painful, hanging between two men who had once shared dreams, now standing on opposite sides of them. Thomas had listened to every word, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling on the wooden table. For a moment, it almost seemed like Ibrahim's confession had softened him. Almost. But then, like a man tearing open an old scar, Thomas leaned forward and asked the question no president, no soldier, no brother could ever escape. If power is so heavy, Ibrahim, then why did you choose it? The words cut sharper than any blade. They carried no rage this time, no wild accusations, just the weight of disappointment, the kind that hurts more than anger ever could. I never wanted palaces, Thomas continued, his voice quieter now, almost trembling. I never wanted flags with my face on them, or soldiers saluting my name. And you once swore you didn't either. You swore we'd be the boys who changed things from the ground up, who'd never kneel to the temptations of power. So tell me, Ibrahim, what happened to that promise? Ibrahim's face stiffened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, pain, maybe guilt, maybe both. For the first time, the iron mask of the soldier president seemed to crack. Thomas did not stop. His words flowed now like a river that had been dammed for too long. You speak of sacrifice, of burdens, of nations hanging by a thread. But who chose that burden, Ibrahim? Was it the people? Or was it you, when you put on that uniform and marched into the palace? Don't tell me it was destiny. Don't tell me it was fate. It was a choice, and you made it. So don't stand here telling me you are cursed. When you walked willingly into the fire, the silence that followed was suffocating. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like a drumbeat in their ears. Ibrahim's lips parted slightly, as though searching for a defense, but no words came out. For the first time, the unshakable captain, the man millions looked to as a shield against the world, looked vulnerable. And in that moment, the two men were no longer president and citizen, no longer soldier and laborer. They were just Ibrahim and Thomas, the barefoot boys under the mango tree again, asking each other questions about life, about destiny, about why some paths are chosen and others are lost. Only this time, the answers would not come so easily. For a long moment, Ibrahim sat frozen, staring at the floor as if the answers Thomas demanded might be carved into the wooden tiles. His hands balled into fists, veins tightening, jaw clenched so hard it seemed it might crack. The silence was unbearable. Then, with a sudden force that made even the guards outside flinch, Ibrahim slammed his fist against the table. The wooden surface shook, rattling the glass of water between them. You think I wanted this? His voice thundered, not in the rehearsed tone of a politician, but in the raw, broken cry of a man drowning under the weight of his own choices. You think I dreamed of soldiers bowing, of carrying rifles heavier than my own bones? No, Thomas, I wanted the same thing you wanted: freedom, dignity, a future where children could laugh without hearing gunfire in the distance. His voice cracked as he pointed toward the window where the streets of Ouagadougou stretched endlessly, filled with people waiting for hope. But when the time came, when our leaders bowed their heads and sold this land like scraps at a market, when no one stood up to the men who looted us, who was left? Thomas. Who? He stood now, towering, every word pulsing with fire. I stepped forward not because I craved the throne, but because if I didn't, another coward would. And then what? More minds stolen, more fields burned, more sons buried in silence. You call it choice. I call it survival for all of us. Thomas tried to hold his gaze, but Ibrahim's eyes blazed with something beyond anger. It was desperation, the cry of a man who had seen too much and carried too many ghosts on his shoulders. I am not cursed because I chose power, Ibrahim roared, his voice echoing against the cold walls. I am cursed because this land has been bleeding for centuries, and someone had to place their hands on the wound. And yes, those hands are mine. And yes, sometimes even I wonder if I'll drown in the blood. But don't you dare, Thomas, don't you dare tell me I did this for myself. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was heavier, trembling, charged with the electricity of raw truth. The mighty president, the captain of a nation, had bared his soul not with calm words, but with fire and fury. For Thomas, the eruption was both terrifying and heartbreaking. He had wanted honesty. He had wanted truth. But what he received was the sound of a man on the edge, half warrior, half prisoner of his own destiny. The echo of Ibrahim's roar still lingered in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Thomas sat unmoving, his face pale, his hands resting helplessly on his knees. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan, turning lazily above them, slicing the silence into uneven pieces. Then Thomas leaned forward, his voice soft, trembling, not with fear, but with something deeper. Ibrahim. He said the name slowly, like a brother calling out to another across a battlefield. I never doubted your courage. I never doubted your heart. But what I fear, my brother, is what this power is doing to you. You carry it like a shield, but I see the cracks. I see how it cuts you every day. And I wonder, how much of the Ibrahim I knew is left beneath this armor? The words hit harder than any bullet. Ibrahim, who had just moments ago stood like a storm, suddenly felt the ground beneath him shift. He sank back into his chair, shoulders heavy, his hands trembling ever so slightly. For the first time in years, he looked not like a president or a soldier, but like a boy again, the boy who used to chase footballs barefoot through the dust, who laughed so hard he could barely breathe. Thomas's eyes glistened, though he tried to hide it. Do you remember those nights, Ibrahim, when we used to sit under the mango tree and swear we'd never bow our heads to anyone? We promised each other we'd fight for freedom, yes, but we also promised to remain human, not statues, not gods. Human. Ibrahim swallowed hard, his throat dry as memories flashed. Laughter, sweat, hunger, the bond of two boys who dreamed of a better tomorrow. Now here they were, one crowned with authority, the other scarred by the system they once fought to defy. Thomas's voice lowered, almost a whisper. I am not your enemy, Ibrahim. I came here not to break you, but to remind you. The fight is not only against the outsiders who steal from us. The fight is also inside you, against the shadow that power casts on your soul. Ibrahim's eyes flickered, torn between pride and pain, between the leader he had become and the friend he had once been. For the first time that night, the fire in him dimmed, and in its place, something fragile appeared. Doubt, vulnerability, a cry no one else was ever allowed to hear. The room felt smaller now, as though it was holding two men in a memory far older than the throne or the uniform. Ibrahim leaned back, closing his eyes as if the weight pressing on his chest might crush him if he stood any longer. The silence between him and Thomas stretched, heavy, suffocating, until finally his voice broke through, low and raw. You think I don't see it, Thomas? He whispered, almost as though admitting it to himself hurt more than admitting it to his friend. Every night when the world is quiet, I hear the voices. Mothers crying for sons buried too young. Children who go to sleep hungry, waiting for the promises I swore I'd deliver. And I. His voice cracked. He pressed a hand to his face, dragging it down slowly. I carry all of it. Their hunger, their pain, their anger. It all sits here. He thumped his chest with a clenched fist. And it never leaves me. Thomas swallowed, but said nothing. The silence allowed Ibrahim to go deeper, his words spilling like water from a broken dam. They tell me I am a hero, he continued, bitter laughter in his throat. They cheer my name, but they don't see the nights I cannot breathe. They don't see the dreams that haunt me, where I'm back in the trenches, where blood and sand mix, and I am powerless to save the man next to me. He paused, his eyes suddenly wet with the shine of unshed tears. Do you know how many men I've buried, Thomas? Brothers. Boys who believed in me, who followed me into the fire because I asked them to. And now their families look at me with eyes that ask why their sons never came home. The words hung in the room like smoke. Thomas clenched his fists, his own chest tightening. I never wanted this crown, Ibrahim whispered, voice trembling. I never wanted to sit in golden halls while my people suffer in mud. But the world left us no choice. If we don't fight, they will strip this land until nothing remains but bones and dust. And so I wear this crown, not because I wanted it, but because someone had to. He turned to Thomas, his eyes fierce, but broken. But tell me, brother, at what cost? How much of myself do I have to bury before this fight is won? For the first time, Ibrahim looked small, not the towering captain, not the firebrand leader, not the unbreakable voice of revolution. Just a man, just a friend, just a weary son of the soil who had carried the weight of a nation too long. And Thomas, watching him crumble, realized something profound. The strongest man in the room was also the loneliest. The room felt heavy after Ibrahim's words, as though even the air was mourning with him. Thomas sat in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of his friend's pain settle deep inside his chest. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, his voice steady but warm, like an anchor cast into turbulent waters. Ibrahim, he began, softly at first, but with a strength that grew as he spoke. Do you remember the dusty football field behind our school? Ibrahim blinked, caught off guard. Thomas smiled faintly. We had nothing, bare feet, a ball stitched together with rags, the sun burning our skin. And yet, when you played, it wasn't just a game. You shouted at us like a captain even then, pulling us together, refusing to let us give up no matter how tired we were. You had that fire before the uniform, before the guns, before the crown. That fire is who you are, not the medals or the titles. Ibrahim let out a shaky breath, almost a laugh, remembering. Thomas leaned closer, his eyes locking with his friend's. You say the crown is a burden, and maybe it is. But to us, to the people, you're not a king sitting in golden halls. You're the boy from the dusty fields who never stopped fighting for his team. Only now, your team is an entire nation. The words landed like arrows, piercing through Ibrahim's wall of guilt. You ask me, at what cost? Thomas continued. At the cost of sleepless nights, yes. At the cost of scars you'll carry forever, yes. But Ibrahim, look outside. Look at the mothers who no longer bow their heads to foreigners. Look at the children who, for the first time, believe that tomorrow might be theirs. That is the cost, and it's worth it. Because if you put down this fight, if you surrender to the weight, then all those sacrifices you mourn, they will have been in vain. His voice shook with emotion now, his hand trembling as he placed it firmly on Ibrahim's shoulder. You don't carry this burden alone, brother. You never have. And as long as I breathe, you never will. You gave me a reason to believe when the world gave me none. Now let me remind you of the same. Ibrahim's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. For the first time in hours, maybe days, he let himself exhale, not as a soldier, not as a leader, but as a man surrounded by the strength of brotherhood. Thomas's final words rang in the silence. You are not alone, Ibrahim. You never were. Outside those walls, the world was not still. Beyond the candlelight of Ibrahim and Thomas's quiet moment, forces were already moving, whispers turning into threats, shadows tightening their grip. Foreign embassies had grown restless. Reports filtered in, diplomats making secret visits, men in suits with smiles that hid daggers, offers of aid laced with invisible chains. A convoy of sleek black cars had been seen entering the capital at dawn, none of them carrying the flag of Burkina Faso. And in quiet cafes, in the corners of crowded markets, men whispered, They will not let this go. They never do. For centuries, Africa had been the testing ground for someone else's ambitions. Now, with Ibrahim tearing away the mask of submission, foreign powers had begun to circle like vultures sensing wounded prey. Sanctions were threatened, loans were frozen, projects abruptly halted. Every step forward felt like quicksand. The harder Burkina Faso pulled, the deeper the trap seemed to go. But the storm wasn't only foreign. Inside the country, old elites who had thrived under colonial contracts began to stir. Men who once dined with foreign generals now raised glasses in secret meetings, dreaming of the day they could drag Ibrahim down and reopen the gates to outside masters. And yet, despite this encirclement, despite the tightening news, something remarkable was happening. The people refused to bend. In villages where children once wore torn shirts with foreign company logos, they now painted their faces with the colors of their flag. In the capital, women marched barefoot through the streets, chanting Ibrahim's name, not as a king, but as a brother, a son, a man who dared to defy. The world wanted to remind them they were weak, but the people were whispering to each other a dangerous truth. We are not weak. Not anymore. Inside that quiet room, Ibrahim lifted his gaze toward the shuttered window. He could almost hear it, the heartbeat of the crowd outside, rising like thunder. They were waiting. Waiting not for a soldier, not for a president, but for him. For the boy who once ran barefoot across a dusty field and never stopped running. And in that moment, Ibrahim realized the storm was no longer just against him. It was also for him. A storm of voices, a storm of hope, a storm of defiance. The world was closing in, but so was the nation, pressing closer around their leader. And Ibrahim Traoré, though weary, knew storms don't just destroy. Sometimes they cleanse. The sun was merciless that morning. It burned down on Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the streets where thousands had gathered. From rooftops, from alleyways, from open squares, they came, men, women, children, all waiting for one face. The air vibrated with a strange mix of fear and hope. Some whispered, "Will he come? Or has he already been silenced?" Others clutched handmade flags, their knuckles white with determination. Rumors had spread that foreign envoys were demanding Ibrahim step aside, that generals in darkened rooms were being offered bribes, that tonight might bring chaos. But then, the gates opened. A convoy of battered military trucks rolled into the square, nothing sleek, nothing polished. And at the front, standing tall in his olive uniform, was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not hidden behind tinted glass, not shielded by foreign armor, standing in the open, his boots dusty, his gaze unflinching. The crowd erupted, not just in cheer, but in a roar so deep it shook the earth beneath their feet. It wasn't the cry of fans for a celebrity. It was something older, something raw, the cry of a people who had been silent for too long. Ibrahim raised his fist, and for a brief moment, the noise fell into silence. His voice, rough from sleepless nights, carried across the square. We are not slaves. Not of poverty, not of fear, not of foreign masters. This land is ours. Its blood is ours. Its future is ours. And I swear to you, no threat, no bribe, no bullet will change that. The silence broke into thunder. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could see. Old men, who had once buried sons lost in foreign wars, wiped tears from their eyes. Youths beat drums and shouted until their voices cracked. Thomas, standing just a few steps behind Ibrahim, felt a chill. He had grown up beside this man, shared food, laughter, hunger, and dreams. But this moment was different. Ibrahim was no longer just his brother in arms. He was the voice of an entire nation. And yet, somewhere beyond the cheering crowds, Foreign agents were watching. Some scribbled notes. Others made phone calls. Eyes cold, calculating. Because they understood what was happening. This wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration of war. Without weapons, without armies. War for dignity, sovereignty, survival. The roar of the people filled the capital. But the roar also carried a question into the winds, one that unsettled every power listening from afar. If Burkina Faso can stand, who else will rise next? The roar of the people echoed for days, but in quiet conference rooms thousands of miles away, it sounded like a threat, a dangerous spark, one that, if left unchecked, could ignite across Africa and beyond. So the response was swift and brutal. First came the sanctions. International banks froze accounts linked to Burkina Faso, making every transaction feel like walking barefoot on glass. Foreign companies, once eager to extract gold and minerals, suddenly pulled out, leaving projects abandoned mid-construction, machines rusting in the sun. The economy, already fragile, was pushed toward the edge of collapse. Then came the threats. Not the kind delivered on battlefields, but the ones whispered through diplomatic cables. Offers wrapped in velvet. Step down, Ibrahim, and we will make you comfortable. Followed by veiled daggers. Refuse, and you will end like others before you. But Ibrahim didn't flinch. He gathered his closest allies, men and women who had stood by him since the beginning. Maps were spread across wooden tables, candlelight flickering on faces hardened by sleepless nights. Food shortages were looming, fuel supplies cut, medicine disappearing from shelves. Every chart, every line pointed to one reality. The walls were closing in, and still he spoke with fire. If we bow now, what do we leave for our children? A land rich in soil, but poor in spirit. A country alive on paper, but dead in truth? No, they may starve us, they may threaten us, but they cannot erase us. Thomas, listening in the corner, felt his stomach twist. He remembered the long evenings of their youth when he and Ibrahim had talked of dreams, of building schools, of ending hunger, of giving their people dignity. Now those dreams were under siege from powers so vast, so invisible, that even bullets felt simpler than this. And outside those candlelit rooms, whispers spread like wildfire. Some villagers swore they saw strange men in the night, foreigners moving with cameras and briefcases, bribing chiefs, stirring doubt. Others told of mercenaries slipping across borders, their weapons hidden but intentions clear. The people roared in the streets, but the machinery of the world was pressing in. Every headline abroad painted Ibrahim as reckless, dangerous, even a dictator. Success was silence. Struggle was magnified. And through it all, a single question grew louder in the hearts of his people. How long can we resist before the weight of the world crushes us? The storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. The drums of protest faded into silence. The world's headlines moved on. But in the hearts of the people, the questions refused to die. Why is it always here, always Africa, where experiments are tested, where failures are buried, and where successes are paraded only when it suits the powerful? Why is dignity treated like a luxury when it should be a birthright? Ibrahim stood before his people one last time that season, the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. His voice was not just a command, but a plea, echoing across the fields and villages. They will try to erase us from their reports, but they cannot erase us from the earth. They will starve our bodies, but they cannot starve our spirit. Remember this. Our fight is not only for bread or for borders. It is for sovereignty, for dignity, for the survival of our children. The crowd stood in silence, and for a brief moment, every man, woman, and child felt the same heartbeat, the same truth, that freedom is never given. It is taken, protected, and lived. And as the sun set over the red soil of Burkina Faso, the story remained unfinished. Because this was not just about one man or one nation. It was about all who dare to rise against a world built to keep them kneeling. So the final question lingers, not just for them, but for us all. When the choice comes between comfort and freedom, between silence and dignity, which will we choose?